seeing.
Of the event here, and it's my job to make sure we get out of here on time because I know how important it is to get to the casino night, the bordello, the cap, the vigilantes, lots of things to happen this afternoon. So with that, I'm going to introduce Kathy, and Kathy, take it away.
Okay. So we're going to lower the lights?
You want the lights down?
Oh, I need my glasses. One of those wonderful turning 50 ones. You know, Richard does these kinds of things all the time. I'm new to giving PowerPoint presentations.
Well,
Yeah, we need the lights down.
Okay, I can do that.
Okay, so hi. I'm going to give a brief introduction of the building construction, the timeline of what happened on September 11th, 2001, and a few of the facts that everyone agrees on.
Could you interrupt me for a second?
Absolutely.
The engineer back there.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Okay. I'm a graduate from Mexico Tech, and in 1978, it goes down to 79, I thought it was 78, but anyway, I graduated out of here, and then I went and worked two different in-between jobs, and then went to Stanford and worked towards a master's degree. I didn't quite complete it because I got sidetracked doing, I got involved in Students for Space Development, and got into a group of kids who were a bunch of us who did a private rocket company. We were going to a competition with the space shuttle. But I don't eat up my little 10 minutes here. Okay, then I went on to two other startup companies. I built the first system that grew done from methane gas in the garage. That company funded for $3 million. That was the last startup. Now I own my own company. Inspecting fire trucks. Okay, all right. So the final report has been provided by NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. Please know that I am not going to review anything that is controversial myself. That is, I'm merely going to lay down the groundwork so you'll be able to better understand what we're talking about. And you know what? This is all the way down. Oh. Sorry, it's my first PowerPoint presentation. So I have to scroll and then. Okay, so we're going to discuss the Twin Towers and then Building 7. The Twin Towers were similar in design in the damage they sustained and collapse. Building 7, however, was very different from the Twin Towers in its design, in the damage it sustained, and the collapse. We're going to discuss the Twin Towers first. They were completed in 1976, were 110 stories tall at 1,368 feet. By utilizing a structural design system new at the time, with central core columns attached to the perimeter columns by long floor spans of up to 60 feet, they achieved an office-friendly open floor plan. Each floor was an acre in size. There were 47 steel core columns and 240 perimeter columns. The core columns varied in size, but a typical one measured 52 inches by 26 inches outside dimensions and were made of, the wall thickness of these were 4 inches near the bottom, thinning down to 2 inches midsection and a 1/4 inch at the top. According to NIST, the Twin Towers were considered to be solidly constructed of 100,000 tons of steel framing. The North Tower was hit at 8:46 a.m. in a direct hit, and the jet impacted around 15 floors from the top. The fire burned for 102 minutes, about an hour and a half, and collapsed. The South Tower was hit at 9:03 a.m. around the 30th floor, was a slightly less direct hit and collapsed 56 minutes later. So the South Tower was hit at a slight angle, lower in the building, and it collapsed first. This was, by the way, this was, by the way, Victor Saraceni's flight, flight 175, that hit the South Tower. Now let's watch the North Tower collapse. Remember, it was impacted 15 floors down from the top and had been burning for an hour and a half before collapsing. Here's the North Tower again, collapsing from another perspective. Oh. Oh, well, that's too bad. Sorry, it doesn't want to play. Okay, we'll move on to the South Tower. It was impacted around the 30th floor at a slightly glancing angle and had been burning for an hour when it collapsed. Here's another view from below. The two white boxes show where the original footprint of the buildings were. Here's a few photos of the aftermath. The North Tower here is in the foreground, and the north facade of the North Tower is leaning up against Building 6 in this photo. There were massive clouds of pulverized concrete that traveled across the Hudson River into New Jersey and filled the streets of lower Manhattan with 4 to 12 inches thick of dust. Okay, let's give a quick look at Building 7. Once again, it's very important when you're looking at all of the evidence to keep the Twin Towers separate from Building 7. They were very different. It was 47 stories tall, about half the height of the Twin Towers, and it was not hit by an airplane. So let's look from Wall Street and watch Building 7 collapse at 5:20 in the afternoon. It had about 8 or 10 separate fires, according to NIST, on various floors. Here we have the 12th floor and the 13th floor fires, and the 7th floor fire on the north side of the building. Here's a photo of the east side of the building at 4:45. So this would be 35 minutes before collapse. Here's the floor plan of Building 7. It's too bad we can't get this down, huh? Here's the floor plan of Building 7. Column 79 is where NIST has the collapse initiating. Here's an aftermath of Building 7. And that is all I'm going to show you. I'm now going to turn this over to, whoops, what am I doing? I'm going to turn this over to Richard Gage. Our speaker this afternoon has been a practicing architect for over 20 years in the San Francisco Bay Area and is a member of the prestigious American Institute of Architects. He is professional, willing to place his credibility and reputation on the line, and who has endured substantial personal sacrifice. Tireless and tenacious advocate for questions that all too few are willing to ask, and truths that fewer are willing to consider.
Thank you. I'm Richard Gage. I've been an architect for 20 years. I've worked on numerous different types of projects, including most recently co-managing this $400 million project with 1,200 tons of steel framing, most of which was fireproof. This is in Las Vegas, right here. But how many Americans really want a new investigation of the collapses of these buildings? Time magazine reports this is not a fringe phenomenon, but a mainstream political reality. Up to a third of Americans, interestingly enough. And interestingly, also, a 2007 poll by Scripps Howard Ohio University finds that about 16% of Americans find that the Twin Towers were brought down by explosive controlled demolition. Well, let's just see where we are at the beginning of this short presentation in this room. I'll ask you 3 questions, and the first one is how many of us pretty much believe the official version of events, which goes like this. We have the airplanes impacting the Twin Towers, an explosion of jet fuel and igniting of these fires, the office contents, and structural weakening of the steel, and then a gravitational collapse down to the bottom. How many of us pretty much believe that? We don't have reason to believe anything else. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. 17. Would you write these numbers down for me, Sherry? 17. And how many of us pretty much are unsure? We've heard a few things on each side. We're here maybe to learn more. You can only vote once, but you have to vote. That's the rules. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 are unsure. And so that's 17 and 8. Sherry, you're writing these numbers down for me?
Dennis is doing it.
Dennis, thank you, Dennis. And how many of us believe the Twin Towers are brought down already by explosive controlled demolition before you even came here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so 6 of us. And so I'll ask you that again. Interestingly enough, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked with explaining these collapses to us, claims that they found no evidence for explosive controlled demolition. Later on, they acknowledged that they never looked for it. Well, how can you find what you're not looking for? Well, thousands of architects, engineers, scientists, and others have looked for it, and it wasn't hard to find. We've been speaking about it in over 100 different occasions throughout the country, and we'll be in Japan, Australia, and New Zealand before the end of the year on a 14-city speaking tour. We've been across Europe and Canada as well. We have 950 architects and engineers signed on to our petition demanding a real investigation based on the evidence that you will see a short version of tonight. In the brochure that you've been handed, there is a 2-hour DVD, and you can go through the detailed information that we only have a chance to highlight very quickly today. We have a website. You have that in your brochure. Did anybody not get a brochure? Raise your hand real high. If you did, there you go, got one. Good. The bullet points and evidence are on the right side. The PowerPoint itself is on the left side, and you can actually watch the DVD online as well. When you find yourself convinced of this evidence, as most every engineer and architect does that we show it to, we ask you to sign the petition and join us. Now, we have several examples of controlled demolitions to make our comparison, because it's the most commonly used method to bring down high-rises. This is what a high-rise looks like when it's being demolished with explosives. Normally, a building like this is demolished by placing thousands of cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building, and then detonating them in a very precise order, starting with the interior structure progressing outward, starting at the bottom of the building and progressing upward. This results in the following key characteristic features of controlled demolition. First, we have a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the building. We have a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's own footprint, because demolition waves remove the column supports. This results in a free fall acceleration of the building straight down, unresisted by the several tons of structural steel designed to keep that building from collapsing. We have a total dismemberment of the steel frame structure, so it's broken up and ready for shipment, resulting in minimal damage to adjacent structures. And of course, we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light often. And there's enormous clouds of pulverized concrete. And of course, we have sometimes squibs or isolated ejections brought about by the explosives. Maybe they go off at the wrong time or ahead of time. And of course, there's chemical evidence found in the rubble. Now, this chart you do have in your brochure, so you can follow along readily. Now, this is all direct evidence of explosive destruction. None of it really can be accounted for by fire, let alone all 10 of these features. So if you have any of them, you're pretty sure you have an explosive controlled demolition, especially if it's backed up by corroborating evidence like government documentation, which we'll be taking a quick look at. Experts agree, yeah, that's a controlled demolition. Foreknowledge, because they're planned months in advance. And of course, video documentation. This is all proof of controlled demolition. And so let's take a look and see how it might apply to Building 7. As you've already learned, Building 7 was a football field away from the Twin Towers, and it collapses at 5:20 in the afternoon, not being hit by an airplane, but it collapses in the following manner. After some debris from the World Trade Center did some damage, let's take a look and see if we have the evidence of explosive controlled demolition in this building. Sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure. Let's listen to this medical student interviewed that evening. Shockwave ripping through the building, windows busting out, a sound of a clap of thunder, and then the building coming down. Very important order of these events that we see. Do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Let's take a look at this, perhaps our second view, narrated by Dan Rad. That's not going to play for us either. Sometimes this happens. It's quite surprising. But you did see this shot. As you can see, the building is coming down rapidly, symmetrically, free fall acceleration. The penthouse goes first, indicating core column damage first. And so how do we get a building to come straight down symmetrical? Can fire accomplish this? Let's take a look. These are the fires associated with this collapse per NIST. And this is about the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of. In this case, on the 12th floor where the initiating event was. Problem is that those fires were out up to an hour before the building collapsed. Let's compare Building 7 on the left with a known controlled demolition on the right now. Is there enough comparison to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? That's the question we have to keep asking ourselves, because that's all we're asking for. We don't have conspiracy theories with architects and engineers for 9/11 truth. We just have evidence we want answers about. How do we get that to happen? Well, we have to remove the 24 core columns within a tenth of a second of each other. Any deviation from that pattern, and the building will begin to tip. And there are plenty of examples of failed explosive controlled demolitions. Can fire accomplish that level of precision? That's the question 950 architects and engineers are asking. And do we have a free fall speed through the path of what was the greatest resistance? Well, we went to the moon to answer a key question about gravity and what it can do. And in this case, we drop a hammer.
So we
Indeed. And the feather falls as fast as the anvil because the resistance was removed. What was the resistance? Air. On Earth, we're used to air. That's the resistance to the collapse at free fall speed. On the moon, we don't have air. The air's been removed. What removed the resistance of 40,000 tons of steel designed to keep this building from converting all of its gravitational potential energy into kinetic energy? Now, if that happens, it can't do any work like crushing so many thousands of tons of steel. NIST acknowledges this building is in fact falling at free fall acceleration for the first 2 seconds, and very, very near that for the rest. How does that happen? We can put the drop distance on a graph of time, and it fits the free fall curve almost exactly. Do we have a total dismemberment of the steel structure? Well, we have a molten steel resisting frame of 47 stories. The perimeter of this building, the structural steel system, is extremely rigid with the columns welded to the beams. How can it fall to 4 stories like a house of cards unless those members are cut? Do we have sounds of explosions, though? Let's listen to Barry Jennings, who was an employee of the 23rd floor, who went back into the building.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building, that side of the building. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then when we made it back to the 8th floor, I heard some more explosions. You know,
What was that?
like a boom, like an explosion.
Now, none of these explosions are a part of the official story. Let's listen to what this gentleman heard. Air Force medic Kevin McGrade. And this whistleblower from the New York Police Department, but we won't hear him today. The other issue is, this section applies to the Twin Towers as well. Is there any evidence of molten metal, and what does this mean? What is this substance pouring out of the South Tower prior to its collapse, about 10 minutes prior to its collapse, in the 78th floor, about the jet plane impacts? Well, NIST tells us that this must be molten aluminum. And of course, molten aluminum looks like molten aluminum. It's silver. It doesn't glow bright orange in daylight conditions at all. So what was that substance? Seen by this gentleman who says 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten steel was still running. Leslie Roberts, structural engineer for the World Trade Center. Is he credible? Fires burned, molten metal flowed, and the pile of ruins still settling beneath my feet, says this urban search and rescue worker. I remember seeing red-hot steel being pulled from deep several weeks after the collapse, says this structural engineer. And what did the first responders say? Well, this is Peter Tully, who cleaned up, the president of the company who cleaned up the site. He says there were pools of literally molten steel. It was dripping from the molten steel. Steel flowed in molten streams. There are dozens and dozens of these quotes and photographs and videos. And here's the problem. Thomas Iger, supporting the official story, notes that the fires are probably only 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Steel doesn't even begin to melt until 2,700 degrees. That's more than twice the temperature available to provide the energy to melt this substance. Well, we're going to be looking at a possible suspect called thermite, which provides molten iron at 4,500 degrees as its byproduct. But before we get to that, let's listen to the official response from NIST. This is John Gross in a question about the molten metal. Darn. John Gross is seen responding and saying, there's no evidence of it, nobody's seen it, and what we provide in the DVD that you have with you is dozens of witnesses who have seen it, documented it, and it's quite compelling. Well, what could have produced all that molten metal? And what is thermite anyway?
Creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough Science call this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide have formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, that's very interesting. Was there any evidence of thermite at the base of the towers in Building 7? Well, Stephen Jones, a physicist formerly from Brigham Young University, nuclear physicist, analyzes a chunk from this previously molten metal, which we have plenty of evidence for, as you can see here. He does his electron microscope data and finds that it contains, well, he rules out aluminum from the jet planes because he finds that it's iron. It's not aluminum at all. It has abundant manganese, so he rules out structural steel as a major component. This is not melted steel. This is a new element introduced by several tons of it into the aftermath of the collapse of the Twin Towers of Building 7. It has aluminum, sulfur, and potassium. These are key ingredients of the effect of thermite. Manganese and fluorine in abundance. Of course, manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. And fluorine is used in very special sol gel type thermites. Together, these are very clear indication of the thermite, the fingerprint of thermite. Gel explosives can be cast into shape. They're very fine particles, the nano scale. And they can be cast into cutter charges, such as this one here. And they cut through in thousandths of a second, designed specifically for thermite. So it's no problem. In fact, the thermite cutter charges in 1984 the casings were developed with consolidated thermite, indicating that there'd be no evidence left behind with the thermite cutter charge, save molten iron, which is because that's the byproduct of the substance. So also, sol gels would leave behind 1,3-diphenylpropane. This stuff has no business being in the atmosphere after the collapse of the Twin Towers or in any office fire. In fact, Eric Schwartz of the EPA says he found this molecule at present at levels that dwarfed all others. He's never observed it in any other sample he's done. So it's not normal. It should not be here. Is there any evidence of the thermite in the dust? Now this dust, very fine pulverized concrete, 100 microns, laid a complete blanket across lower Manhattan, 4 inches thick and 12 inches thick. I have some here. Dr. Jones had this sample and 3 others. He puts a magnet to the dust and he finds that small particles come up to the magnet. What are these particles doing? Many of them are angular, others, billions of them throughout all of the dust is spherical. Now, how did they get there? Well, these are about the size of a human hair, most of them. How does that happen? Well, if you had thousands of cutter charges laced throughout the columns and beams in the building, and you set them off under fairly explosive conditions, you would have atomized the byproduct of thermite, which is what? A liquid molten iron. What happens to a liquid when it's atomized? It forms itself into small spheres because of the surface tension. That's just what happens. He performs his X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy and finds, along with EPA and R.J. Lee, predominantly iron spheres. So this is corroborated by many others. So he concludes that this is clearly evidence of aluminum thermic reactions, and he goes on to reverse engineer, if you will, this by analysis, and he finds that it would have powders of aluminum, iron oxide, copper oxide, zinc nitrate, and potassium permanganate in the original recipe. So he goes back to the dust and says to himself, would there be any evidence in the dust of unignited thermite? So sure enough, he misses it the first time, and he comes up with these small red-gray chips. This one is a 16th of an inch long. Most of them are smaller than that. They're red on one side, gray on the other. The red side, quite interestingly, is composed of the chemical ingredients of thermite once again. And indeed, he does some interesting studies on this with a DSC, differential scanning calorimeter. And he finds, through his 4 samples, that they ignite. They provide more energy at about 420 degrees centigrade. and they ignite in a typical aluminum thermic reaction, or fairly typical. This is a controlled experiment where thermite is also reactive. I think that's super thermite, as it turns out, because this substance contains particles that are 1,000 times smaller than a human hair. In fact, here they are. The iron oxide is about 200, 300 nanometers across. The aluminum platelets, you can see here, 40 nanometers thick and about 500 nanometers long, mixed together in the perfect ratio, 1/4 to 3/4 for an aluminothermic event, set in this matrix, this porous matrix, which is substantially silica. This was documented by Lawrence Livermore Lab and Los Alamos Lab about 10 years ago. And of course, when we have nanoscale particles like this, the chemical reaction is virtually instantaneous because of the incredible surface area. So now you have an incendiary that becomes highly explosive, yet without the large bang associated with normal high-energy explosives like C4 or RDX, and without the bright flash. So if you're going to try to do a deceptive controlled demolition, say in Building 7 or the Twin Towers, you might want to use this, even though it's not commonly used as a device for controlled demolitions. These particles are absolutely extraordinary. It's set on a bed, almost a ceramic and perhaps a hematite structure, perhaps for structural support. And this is, of course, developed in Los Alamos labs as well, with these perfectly rhomboidal uniform-shaped particles of iron oxide mixed quite uniformly. This stuff is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. I think we can all agree about that. This is why you hear people talking about 9/11 being some sort of an inside operation. We don't know who's involved, how high it was, how wide it was. We're just asking for an investigation because we find partially ignited red-gray chips in the dust samples associated with the spheres, indicating the source of the spheres, of course, are a result of the nanoscale thermite. So this is all documented in a 27-page peer-reviewed paper that we have that you can pick up at the table. It's 25 pages, actually. And in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal, taking scientific circles by storm, as you can imagine, documenting these 100 nanometer average particles. But through EDS, XRF, and WDS, identifying these unusual elements with 1,3-diphenylpropane, Dr. Jones concludes that this is compelling evidence that thermite reaction compounds were deliberately placed in both World Trade Center and Building 7. So this is all direct evidence of explosive destruction, all 10 of these features. Now, none of them can be accomplished by fire, let alone all 10 of them. So why? Well, fires have never taken out a steel frame high-rise building, even though we have 100 examples, many of which are much harder, larger, and long-lasting than the Twin Towers, especially Building 5, which was fully engulfed in flames, as you can see here. Did it come down? No. Steel frame high-rises, fire-protected buildings don't come down due to fire. What about that FEMA report? May of 2002, they documented intergranular melting, rapid oxidation, sulfidation of the steel, capable of turning with hot sulfur corrosion attack on the steel, intergranular melting with molten iron invading the grain boundaries of the steel, capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like this girder found one of only 2 saved from the 40,000 tons of structural steel from World Trade Center 7. Fortunately, it was saved and it was documented in the Appendix C. What is their conclusion, though, after the collapse of this building? The specifics of the fires at World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. Our best hypothesis, which is fire and then rain and damage and then complete collapse, has only a low probability of occurrence. You have no faith in your own investigation, your conclusions. They say further research, investigation, and analysis are required to resolve this issue. Unfortunately, for those hoping to do so, they found that the steel had been shipped to China for recycling. None of it was saved except for those 2 pieces that you just saw. So we have expert corroboration. Danny Jowenko, 20-year controlled demolition expert in Holland, says, hey, it starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. It's controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. It's professional work, without a doubt. And we have 30 structural engineers with 8 and 11 truth. Here's one who claims a localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse. Thanks, Dan. Like a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous pattern loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Is there any foreknowledge of the destruction of this building? Well, let's listen to these construction workers and policemen caught on CNN television. About to blow up? How do they know? Do the fires announce that they're about to blow up? And what did Kevin McGrade hear before he heard those explosions? Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? Extremely unlikely. How does the BBC know that the building was about to collapse? They actually announced the collapse 20 minutes before it even happened. They apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. Does this make them psychic? What's going on here? And listen to CNN. CNN claims the building, at 11:07, they announced that the building came down 15 minutes previous. And of course, it didn't come down until 5:20. What's going on here? Was it supposed to come down at 15 minutes after the Twin Towers? If it did, it would have been completely obscured by the massive debris cloud. Pulverized concrete from the Twin Towers. We might never have these shots of it coming down so clearly. So relative to Building 7, let me just ask in the room, do we have direct evidence of explosive destruction? I'll just ask you, the official story says fire brought this building down. I want to ask you what you say. How many believe fire brought the building down? Fire. No, according to the official story. This is the official story. 1, 2, 3, 4. 5. Official story. Fire brought this building down. Anybody unsure at this point? This is Building 7. Before I ask you about the Twin Towers, I won't have time to ask you again about the Twin Towers, but the evidence is far more compelling for the Twin Towers than you've seen relative to Building 7. How many are unsure about the collapse of Building 7? Just not sure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, Dennis. And how many believe it was brought down by explosive controlled demolition? Building 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Thank you. And thank you very much. That's all the time we have for this evidence. And I encourage you to look at the DVD, look at the evidence for Building 7, check out our website. If you support our work, I encourage you to donate in the back. We're supported only by donations from our supporters. Thank you very, very much. And now Dave Thomas will be coming.
Thank you. We have to go through a little bit of electronics change here. It will take very long at all. Reset my watch. Yes, 38. 38.
Man, while I'm setting up, in your capacity at the Institute,
Yes?
what do you do?
I'm the Vice President for Research. I oversee all of the research activity here at New Mexico Tech, from earth and environmental science to atmospheric physics to astronomy to explosives. This is a technical university, and we always have problems with putting together a computer slideshow. We won't start Dave's time until it gets set up. Yeah, others have a chance to get set up. Gage's doing that, I will remind everybody that tomorrow we're painting the M, and that registration, hopefully you registered by now, but at 8 o'clock you can report to Energetic Control Registration Test Center. The buses leave at 9 to the base of the M, and those of you who want can climb the face of the mountain, and then we'll be transported back as the activity goes on. I want to
still record.
I want to let everyone know, especially alumni, that the M was first painted in 1910. Therefore, next year will be the 180th anniversary of the M. So it is my suspicion that.
Thanks for having me here to talk about this interesting subject. Basically, I live in Peralta, New Mexico. I take the carpool to work at Iris Pascal Seismology Instrument Center up the street. I do have some relevant background for questions like this. And basically, I graduated from Tech in 77 and 79 with bachelor's in math and physics, and I got a master's in math in 1980 also here. And my professional career, I started at BDM working on EMP, electromagnetic pulses from nuclear weapons, about the 50 to 100 megahertz frequency range. And then in the 90s and for the first part of the 2000s, I worked at a resident inspection shop in Albuquerque that inspects car parts with kilohertz frequency vibrations. That was a big step down, and now I'm working on seismology where broadband is something that goes as fast as like 100 cycles a second. It's crazy, but it's fun. So I've been sliding down the frequency scale. While I was at Tech, I got the Brown Medal and the Langmuir Award. And I'm also a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. It used to be called SciCop. And it's there are some well-known fellows beside me, like Richard Dawkins and Murray Gell-Mann, who figured out quarks, and Steven Pinker and Weinberg, and quite a few famous scientists there. Pretty good crew to hang out with, I think. The National Center for Science Education, NCSE, gave me a Friend of Darwin Award for efforts in trying to keep creationism out of New Mexico's public schools. And I've written many articles for Skeptical Inquirer, which is a national magazine devoted to claims that you could say are, sort of conspiracy theory, fringe science, that kind of thing. I've looked at UFOs, the Bible Code, intelligent design, the chemtrails, were the Apollo moon landings a hoax? Is the face on Mars artificial? All kinds of things. So that's my hobby. And so as a scientist, I'm president of a group in Albuquerque called Mexicans for Science and Reason. And basically we try to promote the fascinating science that happens here in New Mexico, and we get speakers who talk about geology and astronomy and all kinds of neat stuff. But we also look into fringe claims like hydrogen to make your car get 200 miles per gallon and all sorts of things. So in that process of looking at what is science, I've come to some sort of hallmarks of what distinguishes science from pseudoscience. And one of the hallmarks of science is what we call peer review by experts in that same field. So when scientists, publish their work, they have to put it out there where experts in that same field. You don't get a biologist to review somebody that's doing astronomy, and you don't get the secretary of the Flat Earth Society to do a peer review of a physics or a statistical mechanics paper. You've got to get experts that know if you're trying to pull something. So that's a super critical, important part of science. And another part that's very important is honesty. Science requires the utmost honesty, as from Hamlet, to thy own self be true. And one of the hallmarks of science, in my mind, is the willingness to change your mind in the light of new data. And Richard Dawkins has a nice little thing I'm going to go over about the willingness to change minds and what that means to science. And it's part of science culture. It's not in other cultures like religion or government or politics or debate clubs even. Dawkins said, a formative influence on my undergraduate self was the response of a respected elder statesman of the Oxford Zoology Department when an American visitor had just publicly disproved his favorite theory. The old man strode to the front of the lecture hall, shook the American warmly by the hand, and declared in ringing, emotional tones, "My dear fellow, I wish to thank you. I have been wrong these 15 years." And we clapped our hands red. Can you imagine a government minister being cheered in the House of Commons for a similar admission? Resign, resign is a much more likely response. So basically the culture of science rewards being able to reconsider stuff, even if it's your favorite thing that you really think is the way things are. What makes science tick? And science is pretty good. I can go to the store now, and instead of having to find a payphone to call the wife, do I want, these paper towels or those paper towels? I can just take the picture and text it to her, and she can text me back, oh, get number 2. Science has made some outstanding advancements in our understanding of how the world works, how the universe works, how to prevent disease, how to make cool gadgets, play tectonics, all kinds of neat. The cardinal sin of science is cherry picking the data. You don't get to cherry pick the data. You have to make sense of all of it, and you can't just go picking through and finding things that make your point. The real secret of science's success is cherry picking the hypotheses, the explanations that explain all of that available data. And at the end of the scientist day, we have a handful of explanations that have made the test of time, and they've been validated, and they've been expanded, and they work. We have things like the theory of electromagnetism, or relativity, plate tectonics, quantum mechanics. That's what makes science work. Pseudoscience, things like the Apollo landings were a hoax, or Roswell UFO is sitting in Area 51, are one of the hallmarks of pseudoscience is that inconvenient facts simply disappear. It's just like they're not there. There is often relentless cherry picking of the data, and all the data that supports what you want to prove, you pick, and anything that doesn't support it, it's like it doesn't exist. It's disappeared. And at the end of their day, pseudoscientists can claim a handful of facts that just strongly support their claim. And that's the way usually things go in a newspaper editorial, in a court of law. People, the strategy is to pick the things that make your case and hope that that does it for your audience. That's not how science works, though. Another hallmark of pseudoscience is ad hominem attacks on any who dare to oppose the claims being made. Here's a couple of examples. The Roswell UFO, I've been involved in that mainly because one of my professors here at Tech, Charlie Moore, actually it was one of his failed physics experiments, Project Mogul, that probably became what is now known as the Roswell incident. Basically an attempt to get microphones in the upper atmosphere to listen for Soviet nuclear explosions. And there are lots of promoters, Stanton Friedman, Dennis Belfazer, and I've been trying to engage these people with some of the key facts that just don't support the alien UFO hypothesis at Roswell. And one of these, there's pictures of this debris that was found. And all the UFO authors say, well, that's not the real UFO, that's what the Air Force brought in. But a weatherman remembers Major Marcel, the star, the center of the Roswell incident, trying to convince him that these things that were in the famous pictures had alien hieroglyphic kind of writing. It just doesn't fit with the Roswell as an alien UFO hypothesis. I've tried to engage UFO authors on this. It's like I'm talking in Sanskrit or Swahili. When I try to talk about these things that just go against what they're trying to prove, I might as well be flat on my lips silently. It's as if those facts don't exist. So basically a lot of cherry picking, ad hominem. And here's some of the ad hominem. Basically, instead of dealing with the questions I raised, they made me the 80 clubs. All I got is the darn 80 clubs. But basically, I've gotten a lot of ad hominem over the years by not agreeing with the chemtrail people. They're quite furious with me. Chemtrails, anybody know what those are? All the contrails in the sky are really laced with poison. If I wanted to poison the populace, I'd get one of those little mosquito sprayers. I wouldn't do it from 30,000 feet. The Bible Code was pretty big about 10 years ago, and Michael Drosnin was the author. I wrote my own computer program, and using the exact same method, I found similar coded messages in all sorts of ordinary books besides the Bible, including Drosnin's own books. And when he was confronted with that, his answer to my technical work was, "Oh, it's silly." That's all he had to say. Basically, people in this field dismiss their critics by ad hominem. So now we've got an example from the 9/11 truth movement that I recovered off your website yesterday. Basically, Ben Romero over there, I don't know if you're going to mention this, but on the first few hours after 9/11, he made a statement that basically said it sort of looks like a controlled demolition. And the 9/11 truth people have seized on that. And now they say that any change in that position is evidence of getting paid off to preserve this cover-up that's been going on, supposedly. And I contend that the 9/11 truth movement's inability to recognize this, what Van was doing when he revised his statement, was doing what good scientists do. When you get compelling new data, you change your mind. Just like that scientist they clapped their hands right for back at Oxford. The 9/11 truth movement are not able to recognize this kind of data. It's an example of what I call cherry picking the data. And as far as ad hominem, on the website yesterday, but it's still there today, Richard says the retraction might or might not be associated with a sizable federal grant to the Institute, basically MRTC. And basically he says that MRTC is cooperating with National Geographic to make dubious experiments designed to support the official story. This is something I get a lot with chemtrails, with Roswell, and that's basically, you're being paid off, you're part of the conspiracy. The creationists say I'm part of the Darwinist conspiracy. The UFO people say I'm part of the NASA conspiracy. It just goes on and on. Basically, anybody that doesn't agree with you is part of that conspiracy. So now I'm going to talk about the official story a little bit. And some of this is from Weidlinger and Associates Incorporated, who they were the engineering firm that did an independent analysis for the owners of the World Trade Center. And this was to settle how much compensation do they get. Were there two events? Did one tower knock over the other tower, which would be one event, and you don't get double coverage? Or was it two separate events with each one covered separately? So they did some intense analysis of that. And Basically, they wanted to resolve the question, did the collapse of the South Tower cause or contribute to the collapse of the North Tower? So as far as the official story, basically their conclusion agrees with the mainstream peer-reviewed conclusions that other science groups have found. The Twin Towers were well-maintained, robust, redundant structures. Each collapse initiated in the impact zone due to impact damage and fire. The collapses initiated with the failure of the columns. The floor truss failures did not initiate the collapse of either tower. And World Trade Center 2 fell first because of eccentric damage that compromised the corner of the core, damage to the fireproofing from airplane and structure debris, and jet fuel impacts made the structures vulnerable. And remember, the steel doesn't have to melt, it just has to get soft. When I worked in Albuquerque at our resident inspection, we had to measure the temperature of samples so we could compensate for the change in the flexible strength of these materials. And when you get metal hot, it gets softer and flabbier. And when you get it very hot, it gets very flabby. It does not have to melt to become structurally unsound. Damage to the fireproofing from the airplane and structure debris and jet fuel impacts made the structures vulnerable. Exterior wall structures peeled off orthogonally from each tower. And the collapse of World Trade Center 2 did not cause or contribute to the collapse of World Trade Center 1. This is a little movie that Whitefinger made that basically shows you the structure. First, there's the core structure. And these are big columns going all the way 110 stories up. And that's one component of 4. And here comes the perimeter structure, I believe. Perimeter 2. So this is, it's called a tube within a tube. And that's 2. And then this next component, the roof trusses, is very important. Basically, all these columns are distributing loads. So that these things, by tying together, they make, when one rod has weight on it, it's actually pulling and balancing, so everything interlocks, it's balanced. If I were a creationist, I'd say this is an irreducibly complex object. But it's the very essence of irreducible complexity, things that knit together, and if one component fails, the entire structure can fail. Here's the Whitefinger simulation of the collapse of World Trade Center 1. And so there's the plane. And basically they had an incredibly detailed plane element model. And here's just a blow up of that, showing the core columns and the floors that were affected. And on World Trade Center 1, it was 99 through 93. And basically this shows you the damage on each floor. It shows you which of those central columns were just broken, sheared through, or failed because of fire damage. And there's the final picture. And as far as mainstream science is concerned, when these columns failed, the towers were doomed because of the way this thing knits together. That's how it works. Here's the film they made of their finite element model, and I'm just showing you a couple of the films that I had in this briefing. But basically they, simulated the entire collapse with their very detailed finite element model. And here is that simulation superimposed on a real film of the start of the collapse of World Trade Center. And I'm thinking, these guys have worked really, really hard on the science. And